Hey there, Joe Bacino here, host of the Doomsday Clock podcast. It is Monday, February 15th. Now, we traditionally release a new episode every Tuesday. However, this is your President's Day gift from the 18th Airborne Corps. We're talking about one of my favorite presidents, President Harry Truman. We're talking with a great guest, Joe Scarborough. We are still going to release a new episode on Tuesday, tomorrow, February 16th. But this is episode 6. We're releasing it on a Monday for President's Day. So enjoy President's Day. Enjoy the episode. Thanks for listening.
File into the bunker and take your seats. The broadcast is about to begin. From Fort Bragg, North Carolina, this is the Doomsday Clock. Stories from the brink of Armageddon. Brought to you by the 18th Airborne Corps.
Welcome back to the Doomsday Clock podcast. Joe Bacino here, flying solo today, hosting the show by myself, and it's a big one. We've got a big show today, big show. We spoke with Joe Scarborough. Joe Scarborough, of course, is the host of MSNBC's Morning Joe. He's a prolific writer, writes often for the Washington Post. And you know this guy. You know Joe Scarborough. He's a news of the day kind of guy. He's an inside the beltway kind of guy. Joe, as you know, was a Republican congressman representing Florida. He's a lawyer. He's a political hand. But he's also a guy who has a certain view of the world, a certain view of the country and of the role of civil officials. He's a man with something to say. For our purposes, last year, Joe wrote a book about Harry Truman. The book is called Saving Freedom: Truman, the Cold War, and the Fight for Western Civilization. It's a great book. It's obviously about Harry Truman, and it's a little bit about Harry Truman's life, but it really covers a very specific incident in his life and a specific moment in this country. And that moment is early on in the Cold War. Okay, this is the formation of the Truman Doctrine. So I need to set this up a little bit because we jump right into the discussion with Joe. The book, Saving Freedom, which I do recommend, it opens in February of 1947. Okay, so where are we in February 1947? The British government informs the United States that it can no longer furnish the economic and military assistance it's been providing to Greece and Turkey. That's a problem for Truman. Truman, of course, is president. He takes over as president when FDR dies. He was FDR's vice president. Okay, so Truman understands that both Greece and Turkey are threatened by communism. Greece in particular is sliding towards the Soviets. Leftist forces had been battling the royal government there since the end of the war, and Soviet guerrilla forces are operating in Greece. So Truman felt this is an opportunity to take a tough stance against the Soviet Union. This is really before we understood we were in a Cold War. March 12th, 1947, Truman appears before a joint session of Congress. He makes his case. His case came to be known to the world as the Truman Doctrine, although he never called it that. So that's what we talk about. That's kind of the heart of the conversation. What is the Truman Doctrine? Why was it important? Why is it still important? And the reason it's important, it laid out a choice for the world. Okay, it's really a stark choice, a black and white choice. Nations could either adopt a way of life based on the will of the majority and the guarantee of individual liberty, or they could face a way of life based on the will of a minority. They could face a way of life in which rule is forcibly imposed. Freedom or tyranny, that's the choice. That's the foundational principle of the Cold War. In stating his case before Congress in 1947, Truman requested $400 million in assistance for Greece and Turkey, and that's an enormous sum back then. Congress approved his request 2 months later. This was a de facto declaration that we're in a global competition with the Soviet Union. Truman's address outlined the broad parameters of our foreign policy, and that put the Soviet Union at the center of our thinking about the world. The Soviet Union was the foundation for really all communist activity at the time, all movement of communists throughout the world at the time. So what's interesting to me, and we talk about it, is that Truman never mentioned the Soviet Union in his address, never mentioned it at all. So the Truman Doctrine is an ideology rather than a notion that we stand against the Soviet Union. It's a notion that we stand for something. We stand for a set of principles. And we think about that now, and we all agree on it. It's obviously manifested itself in the world in a very positive manner for us. But at the time, not everybody embraced his logic. At the time, in fact, this looked like an expansion of our foreign policy. This looked like it was an expansion at a time when we were still recovering from World War II. The country was exhausted by war. So, it's a tough sell for Harry Truman, who was considered a lightweight relative to FDR, relative to the big members of Congress. Think about it. He's trying to convince the country that we're locked in a life or death struggle with the Soviet Union. A lot of people didn't want to hear it. A lot of people didn't want to hear we were in a life or death struggle with an ally from World War II. That's what the book is about. And I think it's an interesting discussion we had with Joe. And, some people may be asking, how did we land this interview? How did we get him on the show? Well, he and I know a lot of the same people. I reached out to him, asked if he'd do it. He immediately said he'd do it. And we recorded the interview 4 days later. So, it was a busy period of getting this set up, doing the interview. We appreciate his insight. It's a thoughtful discussion. And with that, let's get on with our discussion with Joe Scarborough. I want to start, Joe, by talking about a picture. You had a picture in your office, in your congressional office, of Harry Truman from 1945. You were a Republican congressman with a picture of a Democratic president. I have a picture in my house of Harry Truman from 1949. And I want to tell you that story because to me, it's the story of Harry Truman. It's Harry Truman with a man named James Hendricks, an Army Master Sergeant, in 1949 in the White House. So the story is James Hendricks grew up impoverished, just like Harry Truman did. He grew up in rural Louisiana, never made it out of the third grade. He had to leave school to help his dad work on somebody else's farm. Brilliant guy, but he never made it past third grade. So 1942, James Hendricks, and Hendricks spelled the same way as the rock star, but a different guy. Hendricks joins the Army. He enlists in the Army rather than get drafted. The country's going into war. I could be of assistance. He joins the Army. 1945, he's in the Ardennes forest with his unit. He's a bazooka man. His company is in danger of being overrun by a German tank force. He dismounts. He takes out 2 half-tracks. He provides medical aid to 2 soldiers, basically saves 2 soldiers, and stays with them as another set of German forces comes through. He takes out another German half-track, and then he pulls an American soldier out of a burning vehicle and extinguishes the flames, saves the guy's life. So all heroic activity after the war is over. His unit recommends him for the Medal of Honor, and it's approved by Harry Truman. So they bring him into the White House. James Hendricks didn't even know what the Medal of Honor was. He knew nothing about it. He just wanted to represent his unit well. He wanted to represent the Army well. He felt he was uncultured. He might say the wrong thing. His father came with him. His father had to borrow a jacket and tie from the White House. His father didn't even have a jacket and tie for the ceremony. And Truman immediately saw himself in this man, really identified with James Hendricks. Okay, so 4 years later, Truman wins re-election in the most stunning American election probably in modern American history, defied all the odds, and he remembers James Hendricks. He asks about him, and the Army reports back he's now a master sergeant. He's at the top of the enlisted field for Army soldiers, and Harry Truman says, I want him to come back in. He comes back into the White House, and Harry Truman says to him, and that's the picture I have, the 2 of them in 1949. Harry Truman says to him, look at us. Look at the 2 of us. We defied the odds. I won re-election when nobody thought I could. You didn't make it out of the 3rd grade. Now you're at the top of the United States Army as an Army Master Sergeant. You know, we've overcome the odds, and that's the American story. What's important about those 2 is that when the country needed Harry Truman and when the country needed James Hendricks, they were big enough for the moment. They were big enough to provide what the country needed, and that's the Harry Truman story.
It is an amazing story. I mean, here's a guy that grew up poor. His father was a business failure. He, of course, failed at his own business after he came back from World War I. He was older than most everybody else that enlisted to go over and fight in the First World War. When the doctor did the medical checkup on him to see if he was qualified under his eyesight, he wrote blind, but still let Truman go there. Truman proved himself to be a very effective leader and came back, but sort of had one setback after another. He finally begged the political machine in Kansas City to let him run for the Senate in 1934 after he'd already lost a county commission race. He ran only because the first four people that the party boss wanted to run refused to because they knew it was a hopeless cause. Truman ended up winning, goes up to Washington, D.C. New York Times writes an article on him, calls him a rube. 6 years later, he gets reelected despite the fact FDR refuses to endorse him, refuses to even campaign with him because FDR thinks he's going to lose in 1940. He ends up winning again. And it's 4 years later that FDR is trying to figure out who to replace Henry Wallace with. Wallace, somebody who was far too left-wing for the Democratic Party, especially those in the South, in 1944. And so they stumble on Truman, who's dismissed as a second Missouri Compromise. He's excoriated by Time magazine and called the mousy little man from Missouri. FDR doesn't really take him into his confidence, even though he knows he's going to die. And sure enough, a couple of months into their administration, FDR passes away. And it's Harry Truman who has to find out at the end of his first cabinet meeting as president about something called the Manhattan Project. He has to make the decision about what he's going to do about the atomic bomb. He's going to have to figure out how to end the war in Europe, how to end the war in the Pacific. And then beyond that, a year later, Winston Churchill gives a speech at a Missouri college called Westminster College that nobody had heard of before and few have heard of since other than Churchill's speech. And there he talks about the Iron Curtain that's descending across Europe. And Truman knows he has to stand up to Joseph Stalin, or Greece will be lost to the communist insurgency that's raging there. Turkey will be lost. Iran will be lost. And with that, the Middle East and Central and parts of Western Europe. And so Harry Truman, this guy that had been considered a joke in Washington, D.C. for most of his time there, Harry Truman is put in a position where he has to stand up to Soviet totalitarianism and has to convince the American people who have been isolationists in peacetime since George Washington's farewell address that we have to re-engage with the world after fighting an exhausting 4-year world war. And Truman does it. And he does it by working with Republicans across the aisle, working with lifelong isolationists, and getting them to understand the challenge that's in front of them. And the fact that Harry Truman did that, the fact that Harry Truman helped create NATO, the fact that Harry Truman pursued the Truman Doctrine and had it passed in Congress, the fact that he pushed the Marshall Plan, the fact that he did all the things that he did in 2 or 3 short years after becoming president of the United States makes him really the most significant foreign policy president in the post-war world that we've had. And we still live in Harry Truman's world on the global stage.
One thing that's interesting about the Truman story is look, mother-in-laws are tough. They can be tough. My mother-in-law is a wonderful person. But if you're president of the United States, there's really nowhere else you can go in order to impress your mother-in-law. I mean, there's nothing else you can do. And here's a sitting president. Only 32 people had ever done this before him. And his mother-in-law is still like, Bess, you can do better.
Yeah. So Harry Truman heard that when he asked for Bess's hand in marriage. And even in the White House, she did not think that President Truman was good enough for her daughter, still would not give him credit, still didn't think he was up to the job of being president of the United States. I think it speaks volumes that he showed her nothing but love and affection and attention throughout her entire life. But yeah, this is a guy that was always looked down upon by the media barons in New York City, Washington insiders, his own mother-in-law. But as I write in the book, Winston Churchill said, "No man more than Harry Truman has done more to save Western civilization. I think I'd be fine with my mother-in-law having problems with me if Winston Churchill, the man who saved Western civilization in 1940, said of me what he said of Harry Truman. And you know what? It's a real testament to Churchill's vision that it took historians about 4 decades to recognize what Winston Churchill saw in Harry Truman in the 1940s.
Truman really was the salesman for the Truman Doctrine, but what's brilliant about Truman and his leadership is that he had enough confidence in himself to vest authority and buy into the ideas of his subordinates. And he also knew the talent he'd been handed by FDR. You know, the real architect of the Truman Doctrine is Dean Acheson, the deputy sextate. And, you know, that's effective leadership. He uplifted Dean Acheson's ideas. And it's also a good example of leadership in that Harry Truman ceded the Europe Rebuild plan to George Marshall, one of the biggest characters in the world, one of the most respected figures in the world, and he called it the Marshall Plan, lending it Marshall's good name, and that's leadership.
I think there's a great management lesson for all of us to learn there, and that is that Harry Truman surrounded himself with the smartest people in Washington, the smartest people in this country, and empowered them to do their job. So many times he would send Dean Acheson out to draft, whether it was the Truman Doctrine or whether it was NATO, or, to participate in the drafting of documents that would lead to NATO to do the negotiations. And so often Dean Acheson would come back or George Marshall would come back and they would ask him, what do you think of this, Mr. President? He'd look at it, he'd read it over, he goes, sounds good. For the most part, Truman always deferred. It actually reminded me, and I wonder if reading about Truman influenced me when I got into Congress. I was 31 years old and I told my chief of staff, brought my chief of staff in, and we had not hired anybody. And I said, your job is to make me the dumbest guy in the room at all times. And he laughed. I said, I'm not joking. Make me the dumbest guy in the room at all times. I want to be learning constantly. Let's surround ourselves with really smart people. And we got really smart people around us. And there were times where they'd come in and they'd give me a suggestion or advice. And I go, okay. They go, what do you think? I said, well, you know what? You've been in the Air Force for 25 years. I'm going to defer to you on this one. Or, you've been in the Army for 20 years. I'm going to defer to you on this one. And so I think I learned that from Truman. And it's something that I think speaks volumes about his management style, that he did surround himself with the very best, whether it was Dean Acheson or George Marshall or George Kennan or Averell Harriman, who was the ambassador to the Soviet Union, a guy who first visited Russia in 1898 when Nicholas II was czar there. He knew the country. He knew Stalin. So Truman had the wisdom to have the best and the brightest around him. And he was served very well by having them there, by asking their opinion, and then by following their advice for the most part.
One thing that's interesting, he actually listened to Marshall in that. And Truman never mentions the Soviet Union in the Truman Doctrine in that speech to Congress. Never mentioned it, never mentions a competitor. And that's something that's a little, maybe there's a little nugget of wisdom that he got from Marshall. And that's an interesting little footnote, a little component to this story.
Yeah, it is. And that's another great example of deferring to somebody. George Marshall said going into it, when he gave the speech before Congress, don't mention the Soviet Union by name. Don't be too critical. Let's not push too hard. Let's keep it general. That way we'll be able to make the argument better and it won't look like we're provoking the Soviets or provoking Stalin. And I think it was the wisest way to move forward, especially for Americans who had seen the Soviets from from late 41 to 45 as our allies. And so, the Soviet Union was unmentioned, Stalin was unmentioned, but everybody who voted on the Truman Doctrine knew exactly who it was focused on.
We understand the Truman Doctrine today. We sort of accept it. We understand its principles. But in 1947, Joe, the basic framework for our foreign policy was one of isolation. It's in our DNA. It's deeply rooted in our history, going all the way back to George Washington's farewell address. And that really was a challenge for Truman to sell this idea. He was going against one of the bedrock principles of the country in this notion of isolationism.
Well, sure. And I'm going to be speaking for myself, and obviously not for you or anybody else. But if you have an ideology, or if you have a framework, a foreign policy framework, and you remain too fixed with that foreign policy framework, and you aren't flexible, and you don't take other realities into account as you're applying that approach, that ideological approach, you're going to get in trouble. It happened, obviously, with the United States and Vietnam. That's the greatest example of how the Truman Doctrine, applied inflexibly, led to the problems in Vietnam. You had actually Dean Acheson at the beginning of Vietnam saying that we needed to take a tough stand against North Vietnam. But by 1968, he was going in telling Johnson the gig was up. He said, listen, this is something we can't win. Obviously, we didn't realize going in that for the North Vietnamese, it was really more of a war of national liberation than it was for any great communist cause. And that's why they fought with the ferocity that they did. They weren't fighting for Moscow. They were fighting for themselves. They were fighting for their villages. They were fighting for their own freedom. And for me, I'll be honest with you, in 2003, at the beginning of the Iraq War, I was swept up with our victory in the Cold War. And I tried to apply the lessons of our victory over the Soviet Union in the Cold War to what was happening in Iraq, what was happening post 9/11. And I applied, and a lot of Americans applied too inflexibly, the same standard that worked in that long twilight struggle for freedom with the chaos and the madness that was going on, not only in Iraq, but across the Middle East. And we have to be very careful in the application of these doctrines and make sure that we apply them in the right sense. Because obviously with the Truman Doctrine, what worked in Greece and Turkey did not work in Vietnam or Iraq.
Truman always felt like isolationism was a danger, and this is something he believed for a very long time. He felt that retreating to within our own borders after the war was potentially going to cause another war, or, force us to slide back as a global power. And so in order to take advantage of the position we earned during the World War II, he felt like we had to build alliances, we had to reach outside our own borders, and, these are ideas he held for a long time even before World War II.
Well, it's interesting. In 1937, I quote him giving an address in Larchmont, New York, giving a speech there talking about the fact that the United States needed to prepare for war, that the United States needed to be aware of what was going on in Europe and needed to be prepared. That was 4 years before FDR would even speak that way, and he was a senator from Missouri who was doing that. So he, for whatever reason, and I suppose it's because he fought in World War I, he saw what happened with the Treaty of Versailles, he saw the failure of the League of Nations, he saw that the United States became isolationist again, and I think he saw fairly early that this was going to lead to problems in Europe, just like Churchill did.
One thing I think people do not appreciate enough about Truman is that he built support for his ideas. He built support for his foreign policy at a time when the Republicans saw him as an opportunity. The Republicans have been dominated by FDR, Democratic president, for so long, and he was such a grand figure, just towering over the country for so long. And they looked at Truman as a lightweight, somebody they can bend to their will, the way FDR traditionally had his way with foreign policy and with domestic policy with his agenda. So now FDR dies. You've got Truman in office, and you've got a guy that was really unpopular and a guy that they could make submit. And yet, Truman stood up for his principles and for his ideas.
Well, you're exactly right. I mean, FDR had been president from 1933 to his death in 1945. Republicans had not been treated especially well by Roosevelt. They had been in the minority and had been completely irrelevant to the national conversation. And in the 46 midterm elections, the Democrats lost big. And so Republicans coming in January of 47, it's the first time that they had been in power since Herbert Hoover was in the White House. And so, no, they were in no mood to do favors for any Democratic president. And you are right. Most likely they looked at Truman and held him in the same low esteem that a lot of other people did and thought they were going to be able to roll right over him. And what Truman did was something that I think Joe Biden may be able to do. It's something that LBJ was able to do. Truman used his experience in the Senate, used his relationship in the Senate over a decade to actually reach out to Republicans, reach out to Arthur Vandenberg, then the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and to strike up a working relationship with him and got Vandenberg on his side. He got the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee on his side and began working one Republican after another to build up a winning coalition. Walter Isaacson was on our show, and was telling the story about how Truman not only worked with Arthur Vandenberg during the day, but at night, after Vandenberg had gone home to his townhouse in Washington, D.C., Truman would actually send his staff members over who had been working on the Truman Doctrine all day, and they would go have drinks with Vandenberg, get his input for the next day's work, and then go back to the White House in the morning and get to work again. So he's totally get Republicans to totally buy in on this concept and to feel like they were partners in it. And I think that really made a big difference. And I think that's something that Republicans and Democrats alike can learn from Truman today.
You know, he was so good at building consensus around his ideas and advancing his ideas and really aligning big groups and aligning the country around these notions. That's why, you know, I have so much respect for him for standing up to MacArthur. And we've talked about that on this show here, that, you know, MacArthur was a titanic figure, you know, larger than life, beloved by many Americans, and even outside the United States in the Pacific. For Truman to stand up to him and to shut down his ideas and to fire him in the middle of the war really was an impressive feat of leadership.
Well, I have such great respect for Truman for doing that. It wasn't easy to do. MacArthur was a titanic figure. Obviously, he came back to a joint session of Congress and gave his famous "Old soldiers never die, they fade away" speech. And it was extraordinarily unpopular for Harry Truman to do that. But he had no choice. And I'm reminded, I remember we were doing a show during the Obama administration, and the Rolling Stone article had gotten out about some things that Stan McChrystal had said about President Obama. I love General McChrystal. I have the greatest respect for him. I did then, I do now. But I remember saying on the air, you got a general talking about a commander-in-chief that way. Listen, nothing against General McChrystal. I've got the greatest respect for him. He's got to go. You can't have that. You can't have somebody deriding a commander-in-chief. And you know, to be blunt, I was very critical of a lot of things that President Obama did as a commander-in-chief. But the military is obviously, they serve a civilian commander-in-chief. And that's something that certainly Stan McChrystal understood and understands now. And it's something that Harry Truman understood after MacArthur kept pushing him until really Truman had no choice. And so it may not have been popular at the time, just like Truman's decision in 1948 to integrate the armed forces was not popular at the time, just like so many of his other decisions that he made, the tough decisions he made, were not popular at the time. But even though he went home with a 22% approval rating, we have been the beneficiaries. We Americans have been the beneficiaries of that fact over the past 75 years. He made tough choices that we still benefit from today.
You know, Joe, that's a great way, I think, to land this conversation. I thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for your time. I know Truman really is an important figure, an important memory for all of us to reflect on right now. So many lessons for the country, so many lessons for military leaders. And, we want to thank you for writing this book, and we just want to be very respectful of your time, and hopefully we'll stay in touch.
Thank you, sir. I would love to. It'd be a great honor. I really do appreciate this.
So that's our discussion with Joe Scarborough. It was a great discussion. He's an interesting guy, has a lot to say. And Harry Truman has a lot to say to all of us today, our 33rd president. There's a lot to think about from his ideas, from his leadership. And we want to thank you for listening to those ideas. Thanks for continuing to support the show. Keep learning about our history, keep talking about our history, and keep talking about the Doomsday Clock podcast. Thank you very much.